A respected judge, a powerful police force, and a single moment of violence that would change everything. When Detective Coleman slapped Judge Reed in open court, he thought he was sending a message, but he had no idea that this moment would unravel a deep conspiracy, expose corruption, and turn the entire system against him. Now, with his family in danger and a city divided, Judge Reed must decide. Will he back down, or will he fight for justice at any cost? What happens next is unbelievable. Stay tuned and don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Judge Marcus Reed, a dignified black man in his 50s, scanned the crowd before turning his sharp gaze to the defendant. Officer Matthew Lawson, a white police officer accused of using excessive force against an unarmed black teenager, sat at the defense table, his face unreadable. Behind him, a row of uniformed officers sat in rigid silence, their eyes locked on the judge, their loyalty to their fellow officer unwavering. Judge Reed took a deep breath before delivering the verdict. After reviewing the evidence and testimonies, this court finds Officer Matthew Lawson guilty of abuse of power and aggravated assault. He's hereby sentenced to 3 years in prison. The courtroom exploded in chaos. The victim's family gasped, some breaking into sobs of relief, while the officers in the back shot to their feet, furious. Shouts of protest filled the chamber, and among them, one voice roared louder than the rest. Detective Travis Coleman, a highly decorated but controversial officer, well known for his close ties to Lawson. "This is a disgrace," Coleman bellowed, stepping forward, his face contorted in rage. "You're turning this system into a witch hunt against the police. You have no right to judge us." Judge Reed remained calm. He slammed his gavel down hard, his voice cutting through the noise. "Order in the court. Detective Coleman, if you do not control yourself, you will be removed immediately." But Coleman wasn't listening. The fury in his eyes burned unchecked, and in a shocking moment of unrestrained rage, he lunged forward and slapped Judge Reed across the face. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The slap echoed, leaving a chilling stillness in its wake. People froze, their eyes wide with disbelief. A police officer had just assaulted a federal judge, and in front of an audience filled with cameras. Judge Reed slowly turned his head back, his cheek stinging, but his expression unreadable. He locked eyes with Coleman, his voice cold and unshaken. "Arrest him!" Gasps rippled through the crowd as officers hesitated for a fraction of a second, then sprung into action. Coleman barely had time to react before 2 officers grabbed him, wrestling him to the ground as he struggled. Reporters in the room scrambled to record. Within minutes, the footage would be viral, sweeping across every news station, every social media platform, igniting a storm no one could contain. The video of Detective Travis Coleman slapping Judge Marcus Reed spread like wildfire. Within minutes, social media was flooded with different angles of the assault, each clip sparking outrage, debates, and condemnation. National news stations picked up the story, flashing headlines like, "Shocking, police officer attacks judge in open court." "A disgrace to the Bodge, Officer Coleman's career in jeopardy." "Racial tensions ignite after judge's verdict, leads to violence." By the time Coleman was dragged out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the damage had already been done. Coleman sat in an interrogation room, his hands still cuffed in front of him, his face twisted in frustration. Across the table sat Police Chief Walter Briggs, a stern man in his 60s who had spent decades trying to keep his department from spiraling into scandal. He watched Coleman in silence before finally speaking. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Briggs asked, his voice dangerously low. Coleman scoffed, shaking his head. What I did? That judge is the one tearing us apart. He just sent an innocent cop to prison to make a damn statement. Briggs leaned forward, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Coleman's. An innocent cop? Lawson beat an unarmed teenager unconscious. And now, thanks to you, this entire department is under fire. Do you understand the gravity of this? You assaulted a sitting judge, on camera, in front of an entire courtroom. You've disgraced yourself. You've disgraced the badge. Coleman clenched his jaw. I did what he had to be done. Briggs exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair. You're suspended without pay. Effective immediately. Coleman's eyes flashed with fury. You're seriously gonna throw me under the bus? Briggs stood up, adjusting his belt. No, Travis. You threw yourself under the damn bus. With that, he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Outside the courthouse, chaos had already begun. A massive crowd had formed, split into two camps. On one side, supporters of Judge Reed held signs reading, "No justice, no peace. Hold cops accountable." Judge Reed stood for what's right. On the other side, pro-police protesters waved American flags and banners reading, "Support our officers. The judge is against law enforcement. Stop the war on cops." The tension between the two groups was palpable. Police officers in riot gear formed a barrier between them. But that didn't stop the shouting, the insults, the anger. Amid the crowd, Rachel Torres, a seasoned investigative journalist, was live streaming. This is more than just an assault on a judge, she told her viewers. This incident has reignited a national debate on police accountability, racial bias, and the integrity of our justice system. Across the city, news commentators, politicians, and activists weighed in. Some called for Coleman's immediate termination and arrest. Others defended him, claiming Judge Reed had a personal vendetta against law enforcement. Social media exploded with hashtags like #Justice for Reed, #Cops Above the Law, and #Back the Blue. Meanwhile, at his home, Judge Reed sat at the dining table, staring at his phone. His wife, Camille Reed, placed a hand on his shoulder. "You should turn that off," she murmured. "You don't need to see what they're saying about you." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "They're calling me a traitor. Anti-police. A disgrace to the system." Camille sat across from him, folding her hands together. "You knew this would happen." Reed met her gaze. "I knew people would be angry. I didn't know they'd be this vicious." At that moment, their 16-year-old son, Jordan, walked in, holding his phone up. "Dad, have you seen this?" Reed took the phone and watched the video playing. A group of angry police officers standing outside their house, yelling, holding signs that read, "Corrupt judge and defend our officers." Camille's face paled. "They came to our home." Jordan nodded, voice tight. "They were taking pictures of the house, too." Reed stood up abruptly, his fists clenched. "That crosses a line." Camille grabbed his arm. "Marcus, please, this is getting dangerous. Maybe it's time to step away." He turned to her, eyes filled with determination. "If I back down now, what message does that send? That threats work? That justice can be intimidated?" Camille's voice trembled. "What about us, Marcus? What about our son? They're not just targeting you. They're targeting this family." Reed closed his eyes, the weight of his decision heavier than ever. He knew the fight had only just begun, but the cost was becoming painfully real. The fallout from Detective Travis Coleman's assault on Judge Marcus Reed was growing more dangerous by the day. While the public debated over police accountability and judicial bias, An even darker truth was lurking beneath the surface, one that would soon come to light. Sitting in her cluttered office at the Chicago Tribune, Rachel Torres, a relentless investigative journalist, stared at her computer screen, her brows furrowed. She had been covering police corruption cases for years, but something about this one felt different. She clicked through documents, testimonies, and old reports until she landed on a name that kept appearing in various complaints: the Brotherhood. Rachel leaned back in her chair, muttering to herself, "What the hell is the Brotherhood?" It wasn't an official police unit. No records, no paperwork, just whispers among officers and accusations buried in misconduct reports. A secret network of officers working to silence opposition, cover up abuses, and protect each other at all costs. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. "Liam Hayes speaking." "Officer Hayes, this is Rachel Torres. I think we need to talk." Officer Liam Hayes was one of the youngest officers in the department, fresh-faced and eager to serve. But after years of working under Detective Coleman, he had seen enough to know that something was very, very wrong. When Rachel Torres called, he hesitated at first. He knew that talking to the press was career suicide, or worse. But his conscience had been weighing on him ever since the courtroom incident. They met in a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city, away from prying eyes. As soon as Rachel sat across from him, she got straight to the point. "Tell me about the Brotherhood." Hayes glanced around nervously, lowering his voice. "It's not a name we use out loud, but yeah, it's real. It's a group of officers who protect their own, no matter what. They intimidate witnesses, destroy evidence, and silence anyone who tries to speak up." Rachel leaned in. "And Coleman. How deep is he in?" Hayes exhaled. "Coleman isn't just in it. He's one of their enforcers." Rachel's stomach turned. She had suspected Coleman was part of something bigger, but hearing it confirmed made her sick. "What else do you know?" she pressed. Hayes hesitated before pulling out his phone. He scrolled through messages before landing on a text thread. "They're planning something," he admitted. "After what happened in the courtroom, they see Judge Reed as a threat. They want to shut him up." Rachel's heart pounded. "You mean they're planning to kill him?" Hayes swallowed hard. "I don't know if it's that extreme, but they won't stop until he's off the bench, one way or another." Rachel nodded, already mentally preparing her next article. This wasn't just about one cop losing his temper. This was about a police force that had turned into a gang, willing to destroy anyone who stood in their way. And now, Judge Marcus Reed was their next target. Judge Marcus Reed had spent his entire career upholding the law, but now the law was failing him. Ever since Detective Coleman's courtroom assault, the threats had grown from angry phone calls and social media harassment to something far more dangerous. One evening, as he stepped onto his front porch, he saw something that made his stomach tighten. His garage door had been vandalized, smeared with bright red spray paint. "Traitor!" Judge Reed clenched his fists. Camille rushed out behind him, her breath hitching as she saw the word. "Marcus, this is getting worse." Their 16-year-old son, Jordan, peeked out from the doorway, his face pale. "Dad, they were here?" Reed forced himself to stay calm. "It's just intimidation, son. They want to scare us." Camille turned to him, her voice shaking. "And it's working." Later that night, as the family sat in the living room, Jordan hesitated before speaking. "Dad, there's been a car parked across the street for over an hour." Reed's heart skipped a beat. He stood and moved toward the window, parting the curtains slightly. A dark sedan sat in the shadows, its engine off. Someone was inside, watching. Camille tensed. Marcus, this is too much. Reed grabbed his phone. I'm calling the police. The moment he started dialing, the sedan's headlights flashed on. The engine roared to life, and the car sped away into the night. Jordan's voice was quiet. They know we saw them. Reed lowered his phone. I'll handle it. Camille grabbed his arm. Handle it. Marcus, they are following us. Our son isn't safe. This isn't just about your job anymore. Reed's jaw tightened. And if I step down, what message does that send? That they can silence justice with fear. Camille's eyes filled with tears. I just don't want to lose you. For the first time, Reed had no response. Across town, in a dimly lit bar, Detective Coleman sat surrounded by a group of officers, the Brotherhood. Judge Reed is a problem, one officer grumbled. If he keeps putting our guys away, we're all screwed. Coleman swirled his drink, his anger barely contained. We need to remind him that this city isn't his to control. Surveillance isn't enough, another officer muttered. He needs to feel real pressure. One of them, Officer Dean, leaned in, voice low. A scare tactic won't cut it anymore. If we want him gone, we need to make it permanent. Coleman's eyes flickered. He didn't respond, but he didn't object either. As the night wore on, the plan took shape. Judge Marcus Reed wasn't just a name on a courtroom door anymore. He was a target. Judge Marcus Reed had always believed in the law. He had spent his career fighting for justice, ensuring that the system worked for everyone, not just those in power. But now, that very system had turned against him. The threats were no longer just warnings. They were a promise. That night, as he walked out of the courthouse, the air felt different. The parking lot was eerily silent, with only a few cars scattered across the lot. He had stayed late, going over case files, unaware that someone was waiting for him in the darkness. As he approached his car, the distant hum of traffic was the only sound, until a sudden rustling behind him made his body go rigid. He whipped around, scanning the shadows between the parked cars. Nothing. Then, footsteps, heavy, quick, approaching fast. His pulse hammered. He reached for his phone, but before he could react, a dark figure lunged out of the shadows. Wham! Something hard slammed into his shoulder, sending him crashing against his car. Pain shot through his ribs. He gasped, stumbling as his attacker loomed over him. The man's face was obscured by the dim light, but Reed caught a glint of metal in his hand. A pipe. You should have walked away, Judge. The man's voice was low, menacing. Reed moved fast. Just as the pipe swung toward him again, he dove aside, the metal smashing into his car's side mirror instead. Glass shattered, spraying the pavement. The attacker came at him again, but Reed had fought enough courtroom battles to know when to use someone's weight against them. He twisted, slamming his elbow into the man's ribs, then kicked hard, knocking him off balance. Panting, Reed hit the panic button on his key fob. His car alarm blared, flooding the parking lot with flashing lights. The man hesitated. A fatal mistake. Tires screeched in the distance. A second car sped toward them. Reed braced himself, preparing for the worst, when suddenly a second figure burst out from behind another car. Get down! A gunshot rang out. The attacker froze as a bullet shattered the ground inches from his feet. From the shadows, Officer Liam Hayes stepped forward, his gun aimed, his face set in grim determination. Drop it, Hayes ordered. Now. The attacker hesitated, but another shot, this time into the air, was enough to convince him. The pipe clattered to the ground. Reed exhaled, chest heaving. You okay, Judge? Hayes asked, keeping his gun trained on the man. Reed nodded, wincing. I think so. In the distance, Sirens wailed, drawing closer. Minutes later, as squad cars surrounded the lot, officers rushed in to detain the attacker. Detective Emma Blake, one of the few cops Reed still trusted, stepped up beside Hayes. "Who the hell is he?" she asked, nodding toward the suspect. Reed, still catching his breath, bent down and yanked something from the man's torn jacket. A badge, partially sewn inside. Emma's face darkened. "He's one of ours." Reed wasn't surprised. Hayes looked away, jaw tight. "It's the Brotherhood." Reed met his gaze. "You sure?" Hayes nodded. "I heard them talking. They planned this. And there's more. They're not done yet." Reed's stomach tightened. This wasn't just an attack. It was a message. Emma straightened. "We need to take this up the chain now." Reed looked at Hayes. "Are you ready to testify?" Hayes hesitated. He knew what that meant. But then, he took a deep breath and nodded. "Yeah. Let's end this." The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with anticipation. Every seat was filled, and the media lined the back wall, cameras flashing, as the trial of Detective Travis Coleman began. The city had been waiting for this moment, waiting to see whether the justice system would hold a corrupt officer accountable or let him walk free, like so many before him. Judge Marcus Reed sat in the audience this time, unable to oversee the trial due to his personal involvement in the case. But that didn't stop him from being there, from watching every second as the truth came to light. The prosecution's first move was calling Officer Liam Hayes to the stand. Hayes took a deep breath as he sat down, his hands gripping the edges of the witness stand. He had worn the badge for years, believing in the good it stood for. But today, he was testifying against one of his own. The prosecutor, Marissa Hayes, approached. "Officer Hayes, can you tell the court what you witnessed regarding Detective Coleman and his involvement in the Brotherhood?" Hayes swallowed hard, but nodded. "Coleman was one of the enforcers," he said, his voice steady but tight. "He made sure no one stepped out of line. If a cop was caught using excessive force, we covered it up. If someone spoke out, we silenced them. And when Judge Reed started cracking down on us, the Brotherhood saw him as a threat." A ripple of murmurs ran through the courtroom. The prosecutor nodded. "And were you aware of any plans to harm Judge Reed?" Hayes exhaled sharply. "Yes." After the courtroom incident, Coleman and his men were furious. They wanted him gone, one way or another. Coleman, sitting at the defendant's table, shook his head, sneering. His attorney stood. "Objection. Speculation." The judge raised a hand. "Sustained." "Officer Hayes, do you have evidence?" Hayes reached into his pocket and pulled out a small voice recorder. "I recorded one of the meetings. Coleman's voice is on it, planning the attack." The courtroom erupted in gasps. The judge gestured for the bailiff to retrieve the device. As the recording played, Coleman's voice echoed through the chamber. "The judge is a liability. We need to send a message. If he won't back down, we'll make sure he disappears." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The jury deliberated for hours, but everyone in the room knew the truth had already been exposed. When they returned, the foreman stood, clearing his throat. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit assault, we find the defendant guilty." Coleman's face twisted in rage as gasps, cheers, and shouts filled the courtroom. Judge Reed exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of justice finally tipping in the right direction. As Coleman was led away in handcuffs, he turned, locking eyes with Reed. "This isn't over." Reed stared back, unfazed. "Yes, it is." And just like that, the reign of the Brotherhood had begun to crumble. The echoes of the guilty verdict still lingered in the city, but for Judge Marcus Reed, The battle for justice was far from over. The courtroom case had exposed the Brotherhood, but dismantling its influence within the police force would take time. However, something had changed. People were finally paying attention. In the weeks following Detective Coleman's conviction, a series of reforms began sweeping through the city's police department. Officers involved in the Brotherhood were placed under internal investigations, and community leaders worked alongside law enforcement to push for greater accountability. But for Reed, the most important change was happening at the Carter Reed Community Center, an initiative he and Officer Liam Hayes had helped launch. The auditorium buzzed with life as families, activists, and police officers gathered inside the newly built Carter Reed Center for Justice and Reform. The walls were lined with posters about police accountability, legal education workshops, and community building programs. Judge Reed stood at the podium, his wife Camille and son Jordan sitting in the front row, watching with pride. Beside him stood Officer Liam Hayes, no longer wearing a police uniform, but a simple button-down shirt, a symbol of his new role as a bridge between the police and the people they serve. Reed cleared his throat and addressed the crowd. For too long, we've accepted a system that protects the powerful and punishes the vulnerable. But today, we take a step toward change. This center is not just a building, it's a promise that we will never turn a blind eye to injustice again. The crowd erupted in applause, but Reed's eyes landed on one familiar face, Rachel Torres, the journalist who had helped expose the Brotherhood. She gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of how far they had come. Liam stepped forward next. I used to believe that loyalty meant protecting your own, no matter the cost. But I learned the hard way that real loyalty is standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. He glanced at Reed. Even when it means standing against your own. More applause followed, but outside the center, a few disgruntled officers watched from a distance. One of them muttered, "This isn't over." But inside, within the walls of the center, hope had taken root. And for the first time in a long time, Judge Marcus Reed believed that change was possible. The story of Judge Marcus Reed and Detective Coleman is more than just a tale of justice. It's a reflection of the real struggles in our society. It forces us to ask, how do we hold those in power accountable? How do we stand against corruption without fear? One key lesson is that silence enables injustice. Had Officer Liam Hayes remained quiet, the Brotherhood would have continued unchecked. But by choosing to speak up, even at great personal risk, he proved that change is only possible when people have the courage to act. Another takeaway is the importance of community involvement. Judge Reed didn't just fight his battle in the courtroom. He took his mission to the streets, creating the Carter Reed Center to ensure lasting change. This teaches us that true reform requires ongoing effort, not just one victory. For us, the lesson is clear. Stand up against injustice, even when it's uncomfortable. Support accountability in law enforcement and leadership. Encourage dialogue between communities and police to build trust. Change starts with ordinary people making brave choices. What will yours be? The story of Judge Reed isn't just about one man's fight for justice. It's about the difficult choices we all face in the real world. When corruption and intimidation stand in our way, we must ask ourselves, do we have the courage to push forward, even when the odds are stacked against us? If you were in Judge Reed's shoes, what would you do? 1. Stand your ground and risk everything for justice. 2. Step back to protect yourself and your loved ones. Comment 1 or 2 below and tell us why. Your voice matters, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget, hit like, subscribe, and share this story with others. The fight for justice starts with awareness, and together, we can make a difference.